So we're kicking off our conversation this morning about authentic leadership. And I'm really honored to welcome David and Bill to start us in this conversation. Thank you, David, and thank you, Bill.
Sean, thank you for that great introduction. And David, thank you for coming all this way.
I never thought in my life I would be introduced with Tai Chi.
Well, it's new learning for all of us, right? So
I've got a lot to learn still.
That is for sure. Well, thank you for being here. Let me introduce David. David and I met first at Davos a number of years ago, but really got to know him. Penny, after I left Medtronic in 2002, Penny and I heard that David and a man named Warren Bennis were going to the Aspen Institute to do a program on leadership and character. And I said, well, now that I'm trying to decide what I'm going to do next in my life, I'd just been teaching in Switzerland for a few months. I decided to go, and David and I got to know each other well. Warren became my mentor and helped me with my books, but David became a good friend, and his wife, Ann. And we, a couple years later, I was invited by the then dean of the Harvard Business School, Kim Clark, to come and teach at Harvard Business School. And you'll meet some of the people I met then. But David and Ann lived a couple blocks away, and they got to know each other. And but he has an amazing background. Born in Durham, his father was head of the math department at Duke University, and so lots of connections there. And then he went to Yale, got his degree. Then he went on to Harvard Law School, and then had uniquely served 4 presidents. No one else in history has ever done that. President Nixon, President Ford, President Reagan, and President Clinton. 3 Republicans and 1 Democrat, which at times President Clinton asked him in the White House. It was somewhat controversial, but has done remarkable things. And many of you have seen him as a commentator on CNN for many, many years. And I think many people have commented to me, and I certainly felt, David, that you were the one voice that really went deeper and thoughtful. Other people, you kind of predict what they were going to say before they said it. And it was very political, but you had deeper insights than anyone else on CNN. So we really appreciate it. And then while I was at Harvard, David was running the Center for Public Leadership, and Penny and I got very involved with the center and many of its fellows that they had, which were particularly joint students at Harvard Business School and Harvard Kennedy School. And we got to spend a lot of time together doing that. So David, just like to ask you a couple of questions. One is, tell me, you served 4 presidents, very different leaders, very different leadership styles, different characters. Which of those leaders looking back on them, do you admire the most, and why?
Well, first of all, Bill, let me thank you and Penny on behalf of so many here for your sponsorship of this and how you've gotten off to a terrific start, really terrific start. I must say, Bill, sometimes when I'm, we both turned a certain age now.
We don't like to admit it. We're the same age. So.
We've entered our 80s, and I'm reminded very much of an old fellow who was walking through the woods one day, and he heard this sound, and he couldn't see anything, and so he kept walking. And then he heard it again, and looked down, there was a frog by the side of the path. And the frog looked up at him and said, "If you kiss me, I'll turn into a beautiful princess." He said, "All right, that's really interesting." He reaches down, scoops up the frog, puts it in his pocket. No, he didn't, didn't just leave it in the pocket. Well, the frog crawls out and said, "Didn't you hear me? I said, if you kiss me, I'll turn into a beautiful princess." "Yeah, I heard you all right, but at my age, I'd rather have a talking frog." So there we are. Let me say just one thing, Bill, that's relevant. There's so much to talk about, but one thing is particularly relevant to where we are today in our lives here, in our lives as Americans, in our lives as global citizens. These things are really, really important. When I went to work for President Nixon, I had no idea. I was a young kid. They asked me to come and work on reviving the draft or retooling the draft system. But in any event, Richard Nixon turned out to be, I think, the best strategist that I've ever seen in the White House. He and Henry Kissinger were just critically important to opening up the divide between China and Russia. That was a big deal. And it had that all been all Nixon was about, the foreign policy stuff, he would have gone down as a good to even better president. It was not all that it had. What he also had were some inner demons that he had not learned how to control, and they got the better of him. So in the end, he brought himself down because he didn't pay attention to the inner workings of leadership. That first of all, you have to understand who you are as a leader, and then you have to sort of build upon that, and then you can take your organization somewhere. But you can't get if you put the organization first, or if you put sort of excelling at beating everybody else up, you can really get in trouble. So as we would be looking just a moment from a Harvard Business School perspective. You told this story about Raja Gupta, who was an all-star in the business circles. He was a critical person on the Goldman Sachs board. He ran what, McKinsey? McKinsey for a number of years.
9 years.
Highly effective. He was chair of the visiting committee at the Harvard Business School. He walked on, people thought he was God over at the Kennedy School. If that had been all that Raja Gupta stood for, he would have been a very, very good CEO. It turns out he wasn't. And I'm not sure he didn't understood this right or wrong, but there was a meeting of the board that was really sensitive in terms of what information was being passed around. And the board discussed very, very quietly, very, very privately, a transaction they were going to make, a big investment they're going to make. That was really critical. They maintained privacy of that they be a secret right there. As soon as the meeting ended, nobody noticed really. Gupta got up, went outside, and found a telephone, called his partner, and said, "Here's what's happening tomorrow morning." They were able to invest at that point and made a bale full of money until people discovered, as Bill discovered, you knew him well. I didn't know him as well, but I was aware of this. Yeah, he'd been fraudulent all this time, and he didn't need that money, didn't need that extra money. But there he did it. And so the question becomes, Bill, both private sector and the public sector, the requirements of leadership are the same, but they start with this authentic leadership, knowing who you are. And you're the one who's brought this now and crystallized it in our national dialogue, what this authentic leadership is all about. This is the guy who started it. And And you'll hear in a moment from Ned Noria, who's come here today and is a wonderful guy who is from the Harvard Business School as well, and he'll attest to this. So I'll leave it there, Bill.
Well, I want it back to hear you. You worked some of these presidents.
Yep.
What do you think? Who of those presidents? You mentioned Nixon's flaws, but
sure. Well, listen, I think you have to put on one. None of the presidents I work for are in the same league as the big hitters of our American history.
Okay.
And historians generally agree there were three who were critical: Washington, Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt.
Yes.
And you just don't get better than that.
Yeah.
So what we're dealing with, we've had some fine people. Jerry Ford is a very fine person, and I worked first for Nixon, and we went through the disappointment. I went down with Watergate. I thought we'd never recover from that. But anyway, along comes Ford. He's a sweetheart of a guy, but he didn't know how to be president because that's never what he wanted to be. He wanted to be Speaker of the House,
right?
And he wanted to go home. If he wasn't going to be Speaker, he wanted to go home. And it didn't work out for him. But he went down in history as someone in a rearview mirror of history. He looks better and better. By comparison to what we have now, he looks better and better. That applies in spades with Reagan. Now, I'm not as conservative as Reagan is, but I have a growing respect for the fact that he kept the institutions of government in good hands. Things weren't torn apart. They weren't belittled. People weren't going to jail. There was much about Reagan that I think we need to go back and look at and say, there was something else about Reagan, Bill. He, unlike some of the other presidents, Reagan got America. He understood America was in his bones. And that was a very, very important part of who he was, that he saw himself as this figure who could be a uniter. And he was more of a uniter than a breakdown guy. So there's much to be said for that in retrospect. The last president I worked for was Bill Clinton, and he illustrates a different part of leadership. He was the smartest president in my memory. I could be walking to a small meeting in the Oval Office. He'd be at his desk, and while two or three of us were talking to him about what was coming, maybe a big hurricane, set of tornadoes coming through Minnesota, who knew what they were going to be talking about? But they would have these serious conversations. But while they were in the midst of conversations about policy stuff, Bill Clinton was also filling out a New York Times crossword puzzle. Yeah, because he was a really smart guy. And you'd be talking to him, and he looked up and say, "Who was that character in the second act of And you weren't quite sure where he were. He was twice the agility and in terms of smarts. And I think in retrospect he looked better. We're going through such a terrible period now that almost anybody looks better. But Clinton was a patriot, and he paid a big price for his shenanigans. By today's standards, they look pretty tame. But there we are.
Yeah, but those are some of his inner demons too, because we all have these flaws, if you will.
Right.
So, but David, you've worked in the Center for Public Leadership. You've worked with a lot of leaders. You've been, I would call, the patron saint of leaders. You've created a whole series of fellowships to help leaders coming along. But as you see, when you wrote a new book, Hearts Touched by Fire, but how do you see, not just some of those specific, but how do you think leadership has changed over you've been at this game for like 60 years. So how do you think leaders have changed, or have they?
Well, there's some things that are eternal.
Okay.
And that's character.
Yeah.
That matters a lot.
Well, that's why you taught that seminar, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Character matters.
Absolutely. And our best leaders have understood that. David McCullough writes beautifully about that, when he was alive as a historian. So there is that quality about leadership that I think goes on and on. But what has changed in part is there is a lot more emphasis now upon collaborative leadership than on individual. We used to think of a leader as someone who got on a white horse and came trudging into town and solved all the problems. What we now know is that you can't do it that way. You have to do it working with others. Patty Stonecipher was the first who ran the Gates Foundation early on, and she used to say, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And there's a lot of wisdom in that.
Yeah, there really is. And this collaboration, and I think, kind of my view coming from a technical background, so you solved a lot of problems, the easy problems. Now we're into the hard ones that require perspectives from different points of view. By the way, that's one of the things that Sean and Benny trying to create here is the collaboration between you, come from different backgrounds, but sharing. But I think, if the values aren't common,
exactly,
it's really hard to get together. If you and I have totally different values, it's really hard to collaborate if we don't trust each other.
Again, I think it's been an essential part of what you've been teaching over the years since you left the CEO and left Medtronic. It has all been about instilling in the younger generation not just the capacity to be competent, but to stand for values, inner values, and have an alignment between your values and the values you want for the organization. That you can become a role model within the organization. That's especially true for generational questions in leadership. Can the older generation prepare the younger generation well? I think that's hanging over us right now, because the younger generation is extremely promising in this country, but it's also a generation that we're now learning has given up a lot of hope. That people are sort of exhausted, and we're now seeing also women and men sort of splitting apart. There's a difference in the genders. The women are doing better and better, and the men are doing worse and worse. The men are, in terms of what their potential should be. And that's been a problem. And women now have they unite a lot. Women are very strong in their relationship with each other. But far more women are going to college today than are men. Yeah. And women have some, hesitation around, and guys with some reason. I just read about, I just read it about there was in the New York Times or one. I think it was the New York Times. It was a poll taken by TikTok,
Mm-hmm.
and the poll was given to women and said, if you were walking alone in the woods, which would you prefer to meet, a bear or a man? And most people said a bear.
That.
A bear. There's something there that we need to repair. And those of us who are older, it's time to pass the torch. But we want to make sure that the people who receive the torch are up to the job, care about it, and are going to lead well. And that is not yet a certain. And it's partly because I don't think we've served the younger generation as well as we should have. We've been reluctant to give up power, as we can see in these races right now. People are sort of clinging to the curtains. And it's time to allow a new generation to come forward. But we ought to work with them. We ought to make sure that they have, training. They have the funds. That's one of the wonderful things about what you're doing here with your foundation, is you're ensuring people have the funds to do some important work. And that is a huge contribution. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, David, I wrote in my first book, Analyzing Leadership, that really the first 30 years of life are really about preparation for leadership. And people, they don't just jump in at age 22. They have to have many different experiences. And then somewhere between plus or minus 30 to 60, you get into your key leadership roles.
Right.
But then, in the old days, people used to retire at 60. And
now we can't get them off the stage.
And they die. Now they can't come off the stage. But I think you represent really what I see as the epitome of that third phase. Let's call it 60 to 90 of generativity.
Yep.
Erik Erikson talked about
Eric, critical to Erik Erikson.
Of generativity, of giving back,
right,
helping groom the next generation. That's what you were just talking about. So you've been kind of the role model for all the rest of us and how you groom the next generation. And you've worked with some wonderful people. Now you've written an amazing new book called Hearts Touched by Fire, saying this generation. But they also, it doesn't hurt to have the mentors, the people to guide, just like Warren Bennis and you and Nitin Nori, who's coming up later, were for me. So how do you see, you've worked with a lot of these young leaders. How has that been for you? And what do you see in these young leaders, and any in particular that you've worked with, stand out? Because you've worked with some outstanding young leaders at the Kennedy School and elsewhere.
There are a number of, don't get this wrong, on my part, there are a number of people in the younger generation who are very, very promising. And Jonathan Kelly was here representing one of the groups that's been supported by this foundation. And he was doing a first-class job. So I think that question is giving. There are not a lot of places where young people can go to get responsibility to run an organization. Mm-hmm. We tend to put them down into the organization. You've got to work, 10 years or so to get up. And young people today they're not going to do that.
Right. They're not going to wait.
They're not going to wait. They don't want to wait. They want to move, but they're not necessarily ready. Because they haven't had the kind of experiences. One of the differences back in after the Second World War and then on through the 50s and into the 60s was that so many of the leaders of that time had served in the military, and they'd gone through hell. They'd gone through very difficult times. We just saw that when they had the renewal in Normandy in the last few days. Their life stories, and you talk a lot about this in your book about the importance of your story, mm-hmm. the importance of your narrative as a leader. Mm-hmm. How do you build that narrative mm-hmm. so that other people can look up to you, and you can be proud of what you're doing, and you can have a sense of this is where we're going. Mm-hmm. We'll make mistakes along the way. We're going to have some hard times along the way, but we can make a difference, and an individual can make a difference. I love that speech that Bobby Kennedy gave when he went to South Africa about the ripples of hope. That not everybody, not a lot of organizations don't have very much, but you can by working closely with in alignment with your values and a sense of security about who you are and an understanding of who you are. you can make a real difference. It's possible to do that still, and you just look at the Malalas of the world, and you see that, and the young kids who win Nobel Prizes at the age of 15. It's a remarkable thing. But nonetheless, I'm reminded of Churchill's quote. He used to say, "I am ready to meet my maker, but I'm not sure my maker is ready to meet me." That's funny. It's a good point.
Thank you. Well, thank you for what you've done for so many young people and helping groom them and giving them the big wind under their
You
wings.
see, your foundation has been a critical part of that. And what Penny has done, what you've done, what you're working with other people, if you stick at it, and you've got to have perseverance, because this is not a short game; it's a long game.
I think that.
And if we stick with it, we can get a lot done.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you'll be proud of what comes on the other side. And you can have a bad phase of your life. Look at Jimmy Carter. He had a rough phase in his life when he was president, and he was berated as sort of a second-rate president. He turned out to be a first-class human being.
He was huge.
And as he lays dying today, that's remarkable. He's kept himself alive. He's probably kind of to his 100.
Yeah,
he's still going.
16 months. He was going into hospice. You're only going to hospice when you got 2 or 3 weeks left to live. And here he was 16 months later.
Yeah, exactly.
Still going.
Remarkable. It's remarkable. So.
Yeah. No, but I want to thank you for what you've done, because I think all of us, and I had people like this early in my career, need that kind of support and people who believe in us. If somebody like you believed in so many people, that's helped them a great deal, and that belief that you can do something great and set your mind to go do it, and I'll be the wind under your wings.
Yeah. And to understand this about what's going on in our politics, we have some really crazy things going on right now. But they're just around the corner. There are some really promising people coming up in politics, especially as governors. Many of them are mayors. A lot of them are people of color. We have a lot more women who are running, who are now winning. The Economist has a big piece this week about the 3 women who are reshaping Europe. And that makes a big, huge difference.
Yeah. So I guess the message is keep the faith.
Keep the faith.
Keep supporting. So thank you, Dave.
Jim Wallace will tell you that.
Thank you. Thank you for all you've done. Thank you.
You got a lot of fans out here. Thank you.